right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Watkins. It's so good to be here. Thank you all who are coming back after attending this morning's keynote. I do want to kind of state the obvious. Yes, we're twins. Yes, we are identical. Yes, and we're going to sound very much the same. And so the one thing that we will be making sure that we try not to do is that when we present together, we get very excited. So we'll try to make sure we keep the pace and not go too fast. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Elbert to get us started.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. I'm going to try not to call you Sissy because that's what I call her. But I'm so glad to be here also. And I also enjoyed watching you this morning. And so to get us started, this is an FYI, I've been here in Ohio for 90 days, a little bit over 90 days. And so I'm still new to the state. So I'm hoping to connect with many of you all who are doing some amazing work here in the state beyond this presentation. So I want to start off with one of our favorite quotes that talks about from Audre Lorde that says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. The objectives we're going to go over, we're going to redefine wellness and traditional tools within a period of a pandemic and social justice and unrest, explore the 9 dimensions of wellness as a framework to create authentic self-care plans, and last but not least, discuss how health equity should be considered when creating a wellness culture within the mental health and addiction field.
So as we talk about social justice and the pandemic, and we're talking about wellness, we have to talk about why we're talking about wellness and what are some of the foundational characteristics that we're seeing right now, and why it's so hard for many of our clients and healthcare workers of color not been able to lean into well-being and wellness. And so we have to understand a couple of things. During the COVID pandemic, there has been an increase of racial trauma associated with Asian Americans, patients refusing to be seen by Asian American doctors, Asian American healthcare workers experiencing racial discrimination, Asian American providers accused of causing the pandemic, and even going as far as being physically assaulted. And so we have to look at that when it comes to our Asian Americans, that they've been experiencing their own form of social justice issues right in the midst of the pandemic too. And so when we look at amongst African Americans, discrimination experiences is more pervasive to that compared to non-Hispanic whites experiences. So we have 11% for whites versus 81% for people of color. And so we know that there's a distinctive difference. And we know the long-term negative effects of racial trauma can impact both the physical health and can be exacerbated by lack of access to adequate medical services for people of color, which can once again be resulted into systemic racism. So when we look at this overview as we continue, we know there are 3 characteristics associated with racial trauma that is pervasive as we're talking about current trends and situations. Number 1, re-experiencing the trauma. So the reoccurring re-experiencing of the trauma, such as the flashbacks, the nightmares, the intrusive thoughts. Avoidance, so trying to avoid it, which is the persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma, thoughts, activities, people, places, and things, feelings as if you are being detached or estranged. And we know that's very hard, especially when it comes to racial trauma. You're literally been harmed sometimes in the very same spaces that you're working, that you're living. And so the last one will be arousal. Persistent systems of increased arousal related to trauma, difficulty falling asleep, frequent irritability, hypervigilance, which is very much common to us in this field. And so as we look at these characteristics and we're associating with this picture and this graphic of the self-care wheel, it is our hopes to try to make sure that when we look at trauma from the self-care wheel, that we understand that we must touch on each one of these different domains in the self-care wheel, everything from physical to personal to spiritual to emotional and also to professional. No difference in our 9 dimensions of wellness either. They just broken these down to very simple categories. So working with everything from safe housing to prayer and meditation to emotional well-being to self-reflection, and also professional development and also purpose. And so when we look at these main characteristics, we know that it can affect and have different responses of who we are. We have some common emotional responses that we're seeing and what you may see with colleagues, family members, and even sometimes within yourself is fear and anxiety, anger, shock and belief, shame, sadness, and that sense of numbness. Some common physical responses: trouble falling asleep and nightmares, fatigue, dizziness, body aches, increased substance use, or even starting substance use, clinging, isolation, hypervigilance, elevated startle reflex, or just a few to name for physical responses. And then cognitive responses: distractibility, looking at the duration, sequence, distortion of, once again, of patterns of thoughts, declining schoolwork or work performance, recurrent intrusive recollections and thoughts, and then flashback and nightmares. So as we look at these common emotional, physical, and cognitive responses, as we do this presentation frequently, we try to make sure that we encourage people and also family members and peers to be mindful of the impact of racial trauma images, because they have meaning. Meaning that we have to encourage ourselves and our colleagues to step away from media, from social media, because they're constantly bombarded with these images. And then when we go back to the previous slide of those 3 different characteristics, they're constantly being re-traumatized. They're constantly being, once again, seeing these images played back over and over and over again. And so we have to see and teach different types of tools and techniques of how they can attempt to avoid the things that they can control. So we know that the harmful impact of racial trauma can definitely have a major impact on our mental health. It can create a hostile and invalidated work or campus climate. It can perpetuate the stereotype of threats of, once again, biases and stereotypes of certain types of cultural people. It can create physical health problems. And then lastly, it can lower the work productivity. So when we're looking in the workplace, of, once again, being able to problem solve and being partially responsible for creating this. This is when we come into the systemic inequities of education, employment, and healthcare. So when we're looking at this harmful impact, it very much has everything from micro to macro impact when it comes to the person's well-being and all the well-being of organizations. And so the cultural factors that influence disaster reactions and coping skills, and disaster meaning the pandemic or social justice, these are just a few to name. Now, of course, this is not an all-inclusive list, but national origin, customs and traditions, the length of residency, language, age, gender, religious or political beliefs, perception of family and community, health and well-being. Also looking at lived experiences of those living with disabilities, abilities or limitations, socioeconomic status, and also education level and geographic location. All these different cultural factors plays a part into racial trauma and also plays a part into coping skills and how they are and are not able to cope. And even within the organizational structure, based off of geographic location, each organization may look at what does well-being and wellness look like for their organization based off of the tradition and cultures of those areas. But at the very end of the day, when we're talking about trauma as a foundational key factor of looking at wellness and well-being within ourselves, our peers, and our organizations, it is always our intent as counselors and even those who may be wellness counselors or wellness coaches is to transcend them. And we're transcending them and wanting them to move between surviving and thriving. We know the basic definition of survival is, to manage to keep going, the ability to make it from day to day, that continue to live, to exist despite danger and hardship. However, there's a difference between surviving and thriving. Thriving shows that you're able to prosper, to flourish, and to grow. And it's very important to understand that many minorities, when we're talking about well-being and we're talking about wellness, they don't understand that they can actually transcend to thriving. Many of them are stuck in survival mode because they're constantly seeing these images and re-experiencing these experiences themselves on a day-to-day basis. Anything you want to say, Dr. Elbert?
Yes, I do. Another component that we often see, and I'll do a little self-disclosure here, raised as in a single parent household, one of the things that I always talk about when students ask me, well, how did you get to this level? How did you get your doctorate, AVP? And when you've grown up, when you have low SES and experienced trauma, it's hard to think beyond what you see on a day-to-day, as Sherrá just talked about, but it's even harder to think about the possibilities of thriving when you don't see it on a day-to-day basis. And so, it's hard to think that I can become an AVP or I can get my doctorate when your inner circle and your inner family are just trying to put food on the table, clothes on your back. The words that we often heard, make sure that you can get from point A to point B. And so when you're working with those, again, I'm as a health and wellness coach, and you're trying to get them to go through some behavior change, being in a survivor mode is not necessarily a bad thing, because you can use that as a foundation to remind them that they're still here. They still have breath in their body. They still have accomplished things, and they already have tools in their tool belt that we talk about at the end that can really help them move toward a thriving mindset. But I think, one of the things that I often talk about with students who have come from very traumatic backgrounds or experienced trauma is getting them beyond survival to thriving is much more of an internal process than external process, because the external they have no control over, but internally they can do the work to start to have a mindset shift. And one of the things I want to emphasize when we talk about in specific cultures, we talk about the superwoman syndrome for many women of color. That is generational for many. And being a survivor has been, in many of those communities, a badge of honor. And so to be very mindful of when we start working with populations going from survivalhood to thriving, to be inclusive, that many of them look at that as a badge of honor because they saw those before them found ways, or as we say, made a way out of no way when it came to having very little to no resources. And so not taking that badge of honor away, but giving them another option on how to thrive beyond survivalhood. And that's all I wanted to really add at the moment, Sherrá.
Great feedback. And so as we talk about this transcendence from surviving to thriving, we can't forget that sometimes that trend, how they show up in survival mode can play a part in how they respond to certain types of situations at work and at home and in their environment. We often go back to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and they often choose and go back to one of those self-defense mechanisms that is most common and most comfortable for them. And so it's teaching them that there are multiple ways to respond across that paradigm, and that you don't have to necessarily always fight, always fawn, always once again freeze, or once again any one of those different ones that they have. And so there has been a new term that has kind of came up in our language within wellness and well-being called languishing. And what languishing says is this: it is that languishing exists in the middle of the spectrum and comes with a sense of stagnation and emptiness. So it's not that you aren't depressed, but you are not thriving. Because we know that mental health exists on that spectrum of depression to flourishing, just like we saw from survival to thriving. And so when we look at this, we know that languishing in the height of both a pandemic and the social justice issues is that you're 3 times more likely, especially minority peers, to be diagnosed with PTSD. And it's interesting because what I've seen is that the language also looks different when they're describing depression, when they're describing languishing, when they're describing thriving. Is very much narrative. We know that many minorities are narrative speakers and they come from narrative language. And so when they say different types of things, we have to often look for, well, what does it mean when you feel like, as Dr. Elbert mentioned, you've made different types of ways out of nothing. So what did you have to sacrifice in order to get that? What did you lose? What do you feel like you gained? And then also, again, as we're talking about these cracked and empty cups, did you feel like you was able to refill your cup when you sit there and had to shift some things around in order to make things work out for you? So we used a particular technique called flow, which is helping them to be mindful, having that mindfulness and having in their meaningful tasks. And so we want to get them to use a sense of mindfulness and being able to be present in each and given moment and not necessarily just focus on what they overcame, can they overcome, and will they overcome? We want to say, can we overcome right now? And so what does that look like, and what resources and tools do you need to be successful? So within COVID-19, the social justice, mental health problems, there are a couple of different characteristics that I'm pretty sure that you've seen and heard within the news, different other types of presentations. But some of the most common variables and characteristics that we're hearing from many minorities is feelings of despair. And this is also can transcend across those who may be also white, but feelings of despair, fear of losing loved ones, decreases in job security, increases in loneliness, and also mind switching from thriving back to survival mode, chronic survival mode for Black people, Zoom fatigue and burnout, increases in alcohol or drug use, unhealthy eating patterns. And I've seen this a lot, especially with a lot of my minority women. It's not that they're overeating, while some may. I find that they graze, meaning that they snack and eat a little bit throughout the entire day instead of stopping and actually eating. So we have different types of interventions, and one being mindful eating and being mindful in what they're eating and enjoying that moment and actually enjoying the moment of preparing it and getting set up. So we go through those different types of techniques as we're talking about that. Social withdrawal, sleep disturbances, and also a decline in physical activity. And we know that from working in my previous employment, when I was working with sickle cell patients and patients living with hemophilia and other types of bleeding disorders, is that when we saw a decrease in physical activity, we saw an increase in chronic pain, we saw an increase in chronic pain medication use, and we also saw a decrease in lifestyle and also in other, sometimes even when it came to spirituality and also purpose. So we know that that's that intersection that we talked about from the very first slide. So we have to be mindful as we continue throughout this presentation that when working with minorities is that overwhelmed people cannot prioritize wellness. Overwhelmed people cannot prioritize wellness. So let's say our definition for wellness. Dr. Elbert?
Thank you, Sherrá. So one of my favorite definitions of wellness that I've been using for decades is from Swarbrick. And Swarbrick says that wellness is a conscious, deliberate, active process that requires a person to become aware of and make choices for a more satisfying life. And that's one of the best reasons why I love working in college health, because we get to give students choices on how to become primary advocates in their own health and well-being. Prior to coming to college, their parents, guardians, loved ones made a lot of those choices for them. And then now they're at an institution of higher education, they get to become more aware and make those choices themselves. But my favorite part is when they take it back to their familial circles and their social circles. And so we know wellness is more than being free from illness. It is a dynamic process of change and growth. And a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in a meeting and we were looking at national and local data around mental health of our students. They did a survey. And as you can imagine, the increase in depression and anxiety went up. But one of the things I asked, I said, I wish we could have added an extra question on here. Because what I wanted to ask was, is this the actual root cause of why you feel depression and anxiety? Because everything was around COVID and around everything associated with COVID. I said, I'm curious if our international and students of color would have put something else as the root cause. And a lot of times when me and Dr. Watkins are doing work around health and well-being, we love to do root work. We don't want what's always presenting in front of us. We don't always want what people are just telling us a lot of times at that first initial appointment or engagement. We want to get to the root, because a lot of times the root is what she talked about this morning, is uncomfortable, because it can showcase where we are systemically and systematically not supporting the whole person. So you can go to the next slide, and I want to kind of transition from talking about wellness to redefining wellness. And the main goal for redefining wellness is to provide some really actionable tips and techniques for all genders, identities, races, ethnicities, nationalities, abilities, sizes, and SES backgrounds, so that way they can have the information needed and focus on their wellness. One of my favorite words I learned early on in some of my health education classes was to cater and tailor. It doesn't take anything to cater and tailor your approach to the person sitting in front of you. The hard part is, because we're often stretched thin, under-resourced, and sometimes undervalued, we don't have the time or energy to do that. But looking at the National Wellness Institutes in the multicultural wheel, I'm also a fan of the cultural wealth theory that's out there that has been very beneficial in the wellness field, is to look at the various factors that influence multicultural wellness. And not that it's going to be different from our white students, because some of the data that I've been working with my partners here, and with some of our students who live in rural areas, is that our rural students' data around health and wellness very highly mimics the same health and wellness concerns of our inner city students. But as Sherrá already talked about, how they describe it is very, very different. And that's the biggest component that I wanted to talk about when it comes to how do we redefine wellness. And so let's transition to the next slide and talk about the emotional cup, because this is the title of the entire presentation, broken and cracked and empty cups. We know that every person has a cup, that innately we want to be loved, it needs to be filled, we need to have security, rest, respect, etc. That is what we are innately ingrained to desire and to want. Some of us have a full cup most of the time, or have ways to get an easy refill. But all of us experience a variety of emotions when our cups get near empty, or have been broken or cracked, and stay within a draining mindset. So some questions, not only do I encourage you to ask those you're engaging with as clients, but for those of you all who are practitioners, because we can't be the best versions of ourselves when we engage in this work if we're doing it from a deficit within ourselves. So for those of us who have experienced trauma, those of us who are of color, we are just as much being impacted by what we're seeing as much as what our clients are bringing to us and we're hearing at the same time. So questions that you can ask yourself and your clients are, what signs or symptoms make you aware that you're near empty? And going back to that definition of wellness, is an awareness. It's being able to identify the different components that don't allow them to thrive within their own life satisfaction, quality of life. You can ask them, do they believe these signs or symptoms differ from those who are people of color, those within their circle, those who have money, those who don't have money? How do they deal with having an empty cup? And then my favorite question to ask, and I was talking about this with Sherrá last night, it's a new question in my toolkit. What would you do differently if you knew the solution would appear with ease and grace? That is the permission they give themselves to go from surviving to thriving. And a lot of times they haven't been given permission to take that next step. And I always tell students, I remember the moment when I gave myself permission to go from wanting to do great work, praying to get a job to make 50, 60,000. And when I was exposed to something beyond that, and I started to see that there could be a different pathway to doing what I love and what I'm passionate about and what innately I was put here to do. But my favorite question is that one, what would you do differently if you knew the solution would appear with ease and grace? And then if I'm working with patients or clients who are religious, my next rephrase of that would be, what would you do if Allah, if God gave you everything you've been praying for? And a lot of times they haven't given themselves permission to go to that next level because all they've seen is a deficit. and they haven't been thriving. Sherrá, anything you want to add to this one?
For our clinicians out there, just the way that Dr. Elbert worded is our miracle question to a T, just rephrased and reframed. So we've used this question plenty of times before with our clients. And so in looking at these last couple of questions, this fourth bullet stands out to me because I see this a lot with a lot of women of all colors. When I ask this question, are you stilling to refill your cup? And they asked me, well, what do you mean by that, Dr. Watkins? I said, what does it mean to you? And I said, what does it mean to steal? They say to take something that is not yours. So we asked the question, are you stealing from colleagues? Are you stealing from family members? Are you stealing from one area of your life and kind of just moving some stuff around? Are you stealing once again to just have a temporary fix just so you can have a boost of energy? Or once again to just, again, survival mode, make it to the very next day? We know that stealing once again doesn't last long. It seems to kind of, one thing I learned as a young child, most of us may have heard this as a U.S. colloquialism is, when you steal it, it doesn't last too long. It kind of burns more more faster and freer than if it was your own. And so when we're stealing to refill our cup, it's not tangible and it's not long lasting. So we want to make sure that we are refilling our cup in a very healthy, in a very fluid, so it can transcend way. Are you aware that the ways that that you fill and empty your cup? So how do you typically fill your cup? And how is it typically empty? And when we go back to one of my favorite things from the rooms, people, places, and things, are there people, places, and things that typically fill and empty your cup? If so, we can now begin to reevaluate and set some healthy boundaries. Or as we're seeing, and I would say definitely within the last 3 or 4 years, you have permission not to be around toxic people. And then what will you do Dr. Elbert ended with that one. So we'll transition as we go into the ultimate question, which is, how do we start the healing process? And what barriers may impact the healing process? So before we start talking about healing and barriers, we want to stop and see, does anyone have any questions with the very first couple of slides that we went over with setting the foundation for cracked and empty cups? Let's see. So no questions so far, just seeing some comments.
And as we start the transition to healing, it is a common conversation with some of the students that I work with, again, low SES, non-able-bodied, various intersectional identities, giving themselves permission to heal from the things they had no control of. And a lot of times when I talk to colleagues who are in the setting in the community, they often believe that what we see within college campuses within health and wellness is, they're just homesick, a little bit of depression and anxiety, but the acuity of what we're seeing within our clinical areas, within the counseling center, the student health center, and how that is manifesting in other areas through prevention, through recreation, the wellness center, which is the health education and promotion office, our student advocacy office, is that we're seeing a variety of levels of acuity with the students coming to campus. And so having to create a multimodal approach to healing and services, treatment and recovery is what is going to be necessary. So we're going to transition on some of these things that we've done and talk about some of the barriers and mediators that are helpful to have equitable care for diverse racial and ethnic groups. And again, you can take a lot of this and look at it from low SES, rural versus urban, when it comes to education. But again, specifically, we're talking about populations of color at this moment. Some of the barriers around personal and family, acceptability, cultural beliefs. One of my favorite things that have been going on specifically in the Black community this past year is that you can have a therapist in Jesus. That has been trending within the past year. And again, it's a reminder that it's not an either or, it's an and. Both can coexist at the same time and be helpful for your ability to thrive. Language and literacy. and not just language for those who are multilingual, but language of when I use certain colloquialisms that are specific to, I've used a couple since I moved here, and my Midwest colleagues was like, we know you from the South when you say that. And so again, when I talk about certain things that have been influential for me growing up in the South and in North Carolina, I mean language beyond just multilingual, but language about what it means to be culturally inclusive in my communities, to look at involvement in care and behavior, structurally, availability, access, how organized it is, transportation, are they having to choose between a bill or using being able to have a copay, and then financial components. If they have insurance, is it a good plan? Can they afford the copays? What are the reimbursement levels? Again, it's one thing to have insurance, it's another thing that when you get the bill because your insurance denied it, that you're having a $500 bill when you thought your insurance would cover the majority of it. We know the use of services look very different in communities of color. Primary care often shows up in urgent and ER facilities. And that can be another reason why health insurance is a necessity. And education and income are a barrier to some of the use of services. The lack of knowledge around mental health and substance use and abuse is another concern. And so that goes within that specialized care. We can get them to go into primary care facilities if we're lucky. And that's why having primary care clinicians do some of this very basic assessment in the clinic is going to be a necessity. When I started off as a health educator, I was part of the student health clinic. So a lot of the education happened right there in time when they needed the information. And that is a huge benefit. And so with that, it helped mediate the barriers that were coming in and what we saw within our students early on in my career. I was able to address in time within the clinic cultural competence. I could communicate with them, talk about medical knowledge in time, address any bias and stereotyping or things that they had brought in with them to their appointment. I mean, it was just a perfect timing of having a very interdisciplinary approach to care. Those mediators are necessary. And what happens is the outcomes, the health status, the quality of life is impacted because you were able to decrease the barriers and open access through a variety of avenues. And then more importantly, the experiences become more positive, more enjoyable, the satisfaction. They actually take the satisfaction surveys that you all put out and you get to make actionable change based off the survey results. Again, sometimes data can help, but if you don't have the data from the populations that you need to serve the most, then you can't really make informed decisions on how you want to change and encourage needed progress within your facilities. Next slide.
Can I mention two things, Dr. Elbert? So looking at barriers and we talk about acceptability, I also want to talk about how one of the barriers is guilt that I get to overcome. I get to excel. I get to be different than where I came from. That is also a barrier. And some people have a hard time in living in that and living within that, that model that I get to, again, excel. And I think it's also important when we talk about mediators, about the quality of the providers, we talk about cultural competence, but we also definitely need to make sure we address biases and microaggressions. Working at a medical school, that was one of the reasons why I was hired here, because this is my topic in regards to my research interest, is that there have been multiple studies done. One of the most popular studies was done of medical students from first year to fourth year, just to evaluate some common myths and discrepancies when it comes to people of color. One of the most infamous questions on that questionnaire asked, is it true that Black people have thicker skin or thicker blood compared to other races? Now, this study wasn't done in 1974. This study was done in the early 2000s. And you will be astounded to know that many medical providers believe that that was true. But this also transcends to the mental health and also substance use enterprise, also organizations. There are many biases and myths that we're still leaning into. One of the most common ones is that all college students use drugs and have sex, when we know that that data is not correct. And so we want to make sure that you, as a provider, as a clinician, those who are working these front lines and those who are in the C-suite level, that you understand your own cultural biases and stereotypes that you may be bringing into decision-making and also into treatment.
So I want to address, while we're talking about healing, and Gilbert says, does healing from the tyranny of the moment require a person to identify their behaviors? Yes and no. It is easier for them to start healing when they're able to identify their behaviors and how their behaviors are impacting their ability to heal. But sometimes it comes from the outside. My research has been focused on, obviously, health equity, health disparities, but also mentoring. A lot of the behaviors internalized that I encompassed as a first-gen college student was not believing in myself. So, and again, you talk about imposter syndrome. A lot of communities have experienced imposter syndrome, but to be able to heal from those things we had no control of required people who saw me. And it is hard to address behaviors that you believe to be normal because that's all you know, until you come into contact with people who can show you other aspects of life, but also see you. And what I mean by see you, it was those mentors early on in me and Sherrá's college career who saw the aptitude, the possibilities of where we could go, and made sure we had access to co-curricular experiences, great internships, access to professors. They saw it long before we did. But when you're experiencing trauma, specifically, I'm going to talk about racism, and you've experienced workplace trauma because of systemic racism, you start to internalize that, and healing is harder to come by until you have somebody say, I see you and everything you bring to the table. It goes beyond allyship, and it goes to the sponsorship needed to say, you didn't purposely put someone like her who identifies like her at the table, but anytime I'm in this space, I will make sure she's here. You create the space for me to come to the table. So my healing, while professional, because it came with some workplace trauma, had to happen because other people saw me. And it's hard to, that's hard to come by when you haven't been surrounded by people who can validate you and your experiences. And so, yes, sometimes it requires a person to identify the behaviors of what they do to contribute to that. But more importantly, when it's because it's systemic and systematic, it requires our allies or those from different identities to see us and to recognize it. And my favorite thing, my first 90 days here has been listening sessions. And that just made me to be present and to see my staff where they are and for what they can bring to the table without coming in to make any changes. And so that has been a big part to that. Next slide, Sherrá. So I want to just share some brief definitions because if you looked at what has been coming out from a lot of the medical associations, a lot of the public health associations, all have started to say racism is an impact to social determinants of health, quality of life. We know that it's impacting overall mental and physical well-being. And so now you've been hearing and seeing more topics and talks about what health equity, health disparities, and inequalities do. So health equity is defined as achieving the highest level of health for all people. It calls for focused efforts to be addressed to avoidable inequalities by creating fair opportunities for optimal health, especially for groups who have experienced social, economic, and political disadvantage or historical injustices. Health disparities, a difference in health status, health behavior, disability or inability, morbidity or mortality between socio-demographic groups. Health inequalities, a difference in health status, health behavior, disability, morbidity, or mortality between socio-demographic groups where the group with the highest burden or rate has historically and systemically been marginalized or discriminated against. This difference is viewed as avoidable, unnecessary, and unjust. We've seen this with trans communities, specifically trans women of color, and the disproportionate rate of murder in those populations. We've seen it with those who are not able-bodied in access to education and quality care, for those who have who are differently abled, neurodiverse. So we've seen it in a variety of communities, but again, it says that this can be changed, and it's not necessary because it creates unjust equity. And then last but not least, my favorite, social justice. And a lot of times when I talk about the overarching work, many people have started to embrace JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. That just creates the umbrella-ish term to encompass equity and disparities at the same time. Social justice is one of several root causes of inequities in the health and well-being of individuals. Social justice challenges the roots of oppression and injustice, including marginalization based on race, class, gender, other social classifications, and empowers all people to exercise self-determination and realize their full potential through collaborative action. And a lot of times for me, Sherrá had got a question this morning about what do you do when you're the only one at the table, keeping the conversation around JEDI at the table, and it's exhausting. And so a lot of times when it comes to the JEDI work, you need to have a collaborative action behind it. But what you can do is to create ongoing conversations that go beyond just when you're at the table. It could be bringing in other persons from different parts of the community or the profession to start bringing in the conversation, i.e. when we talk, it's harder to talk about race and ethnicity, but for those of us who are parents and have been homeschooling this past year, and the amount of trauma we have experienced trying to juggle class, online learning, and trying not to have our children behind in education, and that creates a common conversation with people who may not be ready for race and ethnicity, but from parent to parent in that struggle, it opens the door for me to start doing some comparative analysis on, you know, what it felt like when you were struggling to still do work at the same capacity and level and still support your children. And we know many, primarily women, made the decision to stop working. That could be an open door conversation around social justice on things that are much more palpable than to start talking about racial and ethnic inequality. So just an example on how to engage in conversations, I call it backdoor conversations. I'm gonna bring something that's much more palpable to the table, and then I'm gonna start going into the harder conversations. Next slide, Sherrá. So for those who are like, what are these social determinants of health that you all have been talking about? And so the Rhode Island Health Equity Institute had a really great graphic that I wanted to acknowledge and put in here that broke down these social determinants of health and how to measure them. And so they looked at integrated healthcare and as a domain, and the determinant was within the healthcare access, social services, behavioral health. Within community resilience, they looked at civic engagement, social vulnerability, equity, and policy, and you can kind of see. But when it came to community trauma, they are looking at discrimination, incarceration, and public safety. And again, because right now, social unrest encompasses all of these topics right now, this is a way, again, of how to bring it to the table, because this is a pretty standard social determinant of health model that many public health institutes or health departments are using to have the conversation. It's the conditions in where we live, we learn, we work, we play, and we age. And so it's for those who wanted to have a model before you to see, this is an example of what can be used in these conversations. Equity-based interventions are necessary. And I want to start off, when I say equity-based, I want to say that it's both prevention and also clinical interventions, because we need to seek to improve the outcomes within these subgroups that we know haven't had consistent and equitable access to care and treatment. And so targeting expansions in health services within these populations are more successful and cost-effective. For those who love to look at a theory or a model, the social ecological model, which is a common model used in public health, looks at it from the individual level all the way up to policy. And that allows you to take a more comprehensive approach on how we look at how we serve populations. And so nutritional supplementation for children through WIC programs allows in that social ecological model for you to have much more broad-based community support, but it also is tied to policy at the same time. We know that policy is much more impactful, i.e. 18 and up to have tobacco access, 21 and up for alcohol, the seatbelt regulations, all of those are examples in the SEM model of policy. But for those who are the fillers in this group, those of us who did True Colors or Blue, we like to feel, we like to do one-on-ones and engage. The individual level and the intrapersonal level with small groups above that, we know are impactful. But when you look at from the bottom line, the ROI, the return of your investment, you don't get much more investment on that level because you can't do wide place cultural change. And so that's why when we talk about interventions, it has to be a broad-based approach. And for me, here in higher ed, I've used a very social ecological model because it allows me to look from policy all the way down to individual programs through prevention, education, clinical services. Next one.
So as we talk about these barriers to healing, the very first thing that we can ask ourselves is, what does your culture say about healing and self-care? Did you see that in your household? Did you see that within your schools and education? Did you see that within your workplace, within your community? Because many of us, when we think of self-care, we automatically think of, oh, I'm gonna go get me a massage. I'm gonna go get my nails done or have a pedicure or, just have a down day. But self-care is more inclusive of just that. It's that and plus more. So we need to define healing and self-care as a good way to start. And many of us need to sometimes debunk some of the ideas of what we believe self-care can only be. And self-care doesn't always cost. That is another myth that we often believe. And we need to be able to have the conversations of how do we create self-care, regardless of where you may fall on the socioeconomic status. We also know as a barrier to healing is shame, judgment, and high expectations of people of color. Again, many people of color said, I don't have permission to be able to have a down day. I have to always be on. There's high expectations that I can never fail, or I have to always be great or be, as Dr. Elber had mentioned, the superwoman or superman. And so I don't have the ability to have time to rejuvenate and recoup. And so they have shame when they do, because they're told that they should have to. Then there's stigma of, again, why should you have to have self-care or take time off and those types of things. Poor understanding of self-care methods, as you just heard me mention. Lack of access, again, sometimes associated with financial, but sometimes associated with other types of barriers too. Returning back to the same condition or problem or place. It's like, why go refill my cup when it would just crack because so-and-so did something within my organization or within my community, or it was actually broken with a major chip in it, and there's no need to repair if I'm going to have to go back and have to continue to face the same thing over and over again. Not prioritizing and not putting myself on my list. We're going to talk about that one towards the end. And then self-care is not pushed as much as sacrifice. And those of us who happen to be Christian, we already know that whole term, obedience is better than sacrifice. We've heard that multiple times for those of us who happen to be a part of this religion. But when we talk about self-care should supersede sacrificing, because when we sacrifice, we often have to give up something. Something we'll lose. This is not a win-win situation. And so I want to stop with this slide and let you all know that in order to get these right here, besides knowing these from research and experience, all of these different barriers came from just doing a Facebook post, asking our friends and colleagues and family members, what do you know about self-care and why don't you utilize it as a part of your life? So these are real answers that you're hearing from real people. I am not okay, but I have to be. And I will be okay, but I'm not okay. It's oftentimes those contradictions that we hear with the people who sit in front of us. In BIPOC communities, they're still unlearning a lot of the ways that haven't been taking care of themselves based on the way they've been taught to live in survival mode all the time. So we encourage organizations and clinicians of all types to create spaces where Black and Brown people, all people of color, feel comfortable healing, and also having people who do look like them and who don't, and who also understand that it's important for them to have this within their community and also individually for them to grow. So in creating healing spaces, what should be included in that? And so that's what we can actually talk about as we move to the next slide. But I want to make sure we read this little sticky note. It says, may you be brave enough to choose yourself, even when others don't. So today, our encouragement from Dr. Elba and I is that you choose yourself. And then as you choose to work with your patients and clients of color, is that you encourage them to choose themselves too. So what exactly is culturally competent care and interventions? It's once again, as you heard me state this morning, it's the ability of any healthcare provider of any cultural background and any organization to be effectively able to treat any patient of a different cultural background. It's acceptance, it's respect, it's cultural humility. Again, it's continuing self-assessment of self, attention to the dynamics of differences, and being able to have those courageous conversations when there's a difference in race and gender and beliefs and politics, whatever it may be. Ongoing development of cultural knowledge and resources is just not stopping after 1 or 2 presentations or conferences. Dynamic and flexible application to service models. Again, you heard me mention who's creating the evidence-based practices, who's creating the trend, and being mindful that sometimes our data is flawed because it's only you were only getting answers from the majority population. And then we take that data and we impose it on all populations when we know that it's not culturally appropriate, or once again, it's not even viable when we're looking at outcomes. So our vision,
one piece while you're talking about data. So you just talked about the data piece, but when you do have data, disaggregating your data is Jedi. Disaggregating your data allows you to expose the populations that you're not fully serving. It allows you to be much more intentional in how you have focus groups or direct conversations, because the data is not at a place where you can have it be informing your practice and how you move forward as a community, as an organization. And I always tell people, if you're not disaggregating your data, you're not really trying to do this work for diverse communities. It, for me, is an ethical practice to disaggregate your data.
And so the overall vision is to be able to allow diverse families of people to thrive and to be able to participate and contribute to build healthier communities. And sometimes when it comes to culturally competent care, we don't necessarily have to create it within our organizations. It's working within the community and working because they already have those safe spaces to allow us in to now provide programming for them or to teach them how to provide the programming for them. So again, we don't necessarily have to always do it for ourselves. We can collaborate and we can participate and educate too. So again, self-care is not selfish.
It's not selfish. And public health says the experts are where they already know to be, which is a place that's safe. We have to go outside our comfort zone and go to them. That is true public health and prevention, is to go into them. So that's why a lot of the programs in hair salons and barbershops and churches and mosques have been so very beneficial on breast cancer and testicular cancer and HIV/AIDS. Is because when they did it right, they went into those communities and used the stakeholders and those who were well known within those communities to do great prevention work. That has been proven. I still don't understand why we are upset as practitioners and clinicians when we don't see them in our office. We have to go to where they are. That is a standard practice. So moving forward, let's start treating the whole person. We know there's no single treatment or approach that's going to be appropriate for all individuals. We need to look at treatment from a place of a multimodal, some call it a stepped approach, to attend to the multiple needs of the individual. And I must emphasize, do root work. Just because they're presenting and asking for this, if you don't know what is actually causing the causation to some of this, then you may only be putting band-aids over assisting these individuals. Remaining in treatment for adequate time is vital for success. So making sure you can work with the clients to minimize any barriers. And treatment should be readily available, no matter race, gender identity, orientation, so socioeconomic status. And when I say treatment, it may not be through a therapist or social worker. We're going to talk about some other avenues as we go to the upcoming slides, but looking at non-traditional approaches to how we do the work of treating the whole person. So we just talked about not using a cookie cutter approach because we know there are benefits to healing and self-care. We know that self-care helps reduce occupational hazards such as burnout and compassion fatigue. This is specifically for those who do identity-based work. It helps build resilience. It helps model healthy behavior for clients. One of the things I said coming into my new position here is we have to model health and well-being for our students. And so when we're not at our best, and as Sherrá mentioned earlier in her other presentation, we often have one time to connect and engage with those we're working with. And when we don't show up as the best versions of ourselves, we're doing a disservice to the things that we love that know can be impactful for those we are working with and other stakeholders. It fortifies relationships and clients and others when you're looking at the benefits of self-care. And my favorite, it contributes to realistic goal setting. As a health and wellness coach, using SMART goals is the biggest way of engaging those who want to do behavior change. And we know over time it enhances self-esteem and confidence.
So as we talk about what we actually can do from an organizational level, again, back to an individual level, from an organizational strategy, encouraging resilience and creating resiliency trends within your organization. Team grounding, providing grounding activities before meetings, at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, especially for those of us who are doing this work across the wellness and medical paradigm. We're holding space and we're holding trauma and we're hearing trauma of other people. How do we ground ourselves before we go back into our homes and community? Providing effective communication. As I stated within the white system value, we want to make sure that communication is open and it doesn't transcend only from the top down. You want to make sure that it transcends from top down, down to up in all different ways to make sure that all decision making is known and also, once again, caters to who you're actually providing the treatment to. Having peer support. Someone actually mentioned mentorship inside the chat box. Mentorship and peer support is very crucial when it comes to not just professional development, but also when it comes to, again, building that sense of trauma-informed care within our workplaces. And then mindfulness practice. Individual strategies, self-reflection, focusing on the here and now, enhancing self-compassion, grounding activities, listening to your body and maintaining a sense of routine and separating work from home. And so these are the three things that I recommend in learning how to be present. Number one, honor your reactions to what is happening around you. What you experience is what you experience. We don't have to reframe it. We don't have to reconstruct it. It's your experience. Tune into those reactions and ask yourself, how does my reaction inform me of what is important to me and what is not important to me? From the reminder of what matters to you, look for ways to act on what is important to you each day. And lastly, bring healthy self-care and compassion to the forefront each day. One way to be present also is to work with what we call the 4-7-8 technique. To be able to close your mouth and inhale through your nose for a silent count of 4. Hold your breath for a silent count of 7. Exhale completely through your mouth to a silent count of 8. And then repeat the cycle 3 more times for a total of 4 breaths. Very, very cleansing, very much helping with grounding and being present. And just being mindful for those of us who, once again, may have limitations to our breathing or to our pulmonary system, you can modify the numbers. Do what works best for you. And non-traditional interventions. Dr. Elbert?
So this is probably one of my favorite slides because, again, you know, a lot of times people don't want to talk about non-traditional interventions or the inclusion of spirituality, religion, and faith, because sometimes the data doesn't always say that this absolutely will work. But the belief that something can be impactful is just as beneficial as other methodologies and treatment components. And so we know through a variety of conversations with those who do folk and healing and non-traditional therapies is that you can use heat or cold, massage, and therapeutic touch. And I just want to emphasize touch by itself is healing. And that's why a lot of people have struggled due to COVID, due to physical and social distancing, because they haven't had anybody give them a hug or to touch them. Yoga and Tai Chi. And I want to emphasize with some of the physical activities and movement therapies, a lot have now been decentralized to incorporate identities. And so you have hip hop yoga, and now you have one of my favorites, twerk yoga and twerk fitness for those who like hip hop and really moving the body in a very different way. I've also seen an increase in people trying out hypnosis, aromatherapy. I'm going to go back to grounding because a lot of people who haven't experienced grounding are trying out right now. And one of the easiest ways that especially when we're in the South and we had a lot of grassy area, was just to, you know, we grew up outside barefooted and running, and people didn't understand that that was a way of starting your grounding technique, which is to recenter barefooted with the earth. And why so many people are environmental supporters of not taking away all of our green area. You can do it at the beach. You can do it with water if you don't have green spaces. Reiki, energy therapy. I know EDMR is another combo form of some clinical therapists are using that. My favorite, prayer and meditation. And just as a caveat, one of the things I've heard over my time working in college health is that a lot of times there is fear from clinicians to bring up faith, spirituality, and religion, especially when you work for the state or government. But you can always allow the client to introduce things that have been beneficial to their healing and survivalhood by you asking and opening the door to allow them to answer that question. A variety of support groups, a lot of sister circles, healing circles have been very, very popular, peer support, mentor programs. So again, when we start going down to the different dimensions of wellness and building a tube belt or using your gym bag analogy, which is what we'll use, giving them options that not one method has to be the end all be all. You can try a lot of things to find out what works for you, what could be different. And then for those who want to emphasize the faith and spirituality outside of traditional Christian values, working with the curandero or shaman, a guide or faith healer, ancestral healers are very popular right now. Those who do tarot cards or other types of readings. And again, it's just introducing them to things that they can embrace that can be helpful. And a lot of times our own bias is why we can't introduce these as options to those we engage with as clients or patients, is because we are skeptical. But the whole purpose of wellness, again, is giving them a chance to choose. And one of my favorite things I used to say early on as a health educator, it's not my job to preach, it's my job to teach and give them options on what will work for them based off their values and beliefs. That's it. That's all we have to do, is to give them the option of choices. Despite what we believe, despite our own personal values, we have to give those we engage with the options to find pathways to healing and to health and wellness. Sherrá?
So Dr. Elba and I are lucky enough to have a wonderful cousin this slide and the previous slide is actually his dissertation research, in which he just actually looked at. And so we talked to him in preparing for this presentation and asked him, what has faith across all races and culture looked like in the midst of COVID and social justice issues? And so he showed me this slide, and I love the way that it defines what faith in religion and spirituality is. It says faith is knowing, religion is doing, and spirituality is being. And what this data shows from the Pew study, so Pew is a very well-known, respected agency that looks at data for religion, is that it says Americans across different types, compared to other types of countries, grew stronger in their spirituality and their faith during the midst of COVID. And so when asking him, what has faith in and spirituality look like in the midst of social justice, he stated that, it's waxing and waning, and meaning that there has been an increase in spirituality. However, particularly among people of color, they have shifted their viewpoint of what it means of their faith and spirituality. So those who have typically been millennials and been within the church, they are shifted to more ancestral, tarot card reading, sister circles, as we say, Sunday brunch, those types of things. And so we know that they're creating new ways to be fulfilled, and that's also okay. So I already actually, unfortunately, mentioned this question. So we're going to skip ahead to, once again, helping you all to get in shape before we leave. And so we're going to skip ahead to, once again, looking and using the 9 dimensions of wellness as our background. And we're going to be using the framework of a gym bag. And so each particular wellness gym bag has an item in it that represents one of the 9 dimensions of wellness. And so I'm going to let Dr. Elber get started as we talk about what is the gym bag and its purpose of spirituality.
And I just want to say yes to Karen's analogy. One of my favorite quotes that I heard at a women's leadership symposium back in 2014 from a CEO. And they asked how did she get to the place where she was the first woman CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And she said, I inhaled faith and exhaled fear. So I'm right there with you, Karen. You have to have those things that remind you. And as my pastor will always say, keep it ever before you. So print it out, put it in front of you so you have that reminder. So we're going to kick off with spiritual wellness. And I love this one to start off because it encompasses and shapes everything on how we engage. Spiritual wellness is about the beliefs, the principles, and values that guide us as individuals. It's our purpose of why we're here. And for those who encompass spirituality with their faith and religion, it blends very, very nicely. And so what you see on the activities pieces is how me as a coach and Sherrá as a therapist give examples to those we engage with. And so we have, like when I'm teaching this in some of the first year seminar courses, they actually have a wellness wheel and they get to start marking things off and start making a plan on how to start building their gym bag. So again, we're giving you tools for you, but also tips for you to engage with those you work with. And all of this has already been uploaded into the Hoover app. Physical wellness is not just about exercise. It's also about access to healthy eating, especially if they're in food deserts, sleeping, having your well person check on an ongoing basis, being able to prevent and minimize risk and injuries. And so the reason why we chose the tennis shoes is because, again, it has to be movement behind physical wellness. It requires a lot more physical action than the other dimensions require. And by themselves, the tennis shoes does nothing, but for some look very, very cute on your feet. But until you put them on, they do nothing but look good. But it's the movement and action behind it that you start to see the shoes become much more effective and impactful in your growth and movement toward your purpose. And so you can see some of the examples we talk about with those we engage with. And then Sherrá will talk about emotional.
And so next, as we look at emotional wellness, we use the yoga mats, or sometimes we have the yoga, different types of shapes and sizes. And so when we look at emotional wellness, it's the wellness and the acceptance of one's feelings and cognitions, coping, processing, expressing emotions. And so with the use of the exercise mat or the yoga mat, the connection is that they come in different sizes, shapes, and density. Its purpose is to give you a foundation. So even when on the ground, we are protected. And sometimes you must lay it all out on the mat. So it doesn't matter how big or how small or how, once again, your emotions look like. Everyone's emotions actually matter. And it's actually okay to kind of lay it all out. And one of my favorite demographics when talking about emotional wellness is, once again, playing the whole keyboard. You have to, once again, that from the outside part of the keyboard, these are things that have been taught: humility, forgiveness, empathy, compassion, sympathy, patience, shame, cooperation, and gratitude. But it's those middle keys, it's those keys that's in the middle that is innate, that's hardwired: sadness, joy, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. So when we play it, it all makes beautiful music. You don't just have to work on one particular end, use them all. So as we're talking about our title of this presentation, you can't pour from an empty cup. You must, you have to take care of yourself first, is a very popular statement and analogy. So once again, as we're talking about our emotions and we're talking about the use of the exercise mat or the yoga mat, you understand that your emotions, once again, play a part. It's filling your cup and, once again, emptying your cup. It's a very big component. Social wellness. With social wellness, we're using a change of clothes as the connection. Social wellness encompasses connections and relationships with individuals and sometimes even groups. Again, and with our world around us, it means creating a supportive and caring network of friends and family. And this can be very important because we often say, sometimes we don't get to choose our family, but you can create one. And so with the connection, it says that each set of clothing has a specific or multiple purpose. This relates to the diverse types of people you will interact with and should also have within your circle. I may have work clothes, I may have workout clothes, or I may have a workout outfit that I've been wearing in my Zoom meetings that can be a little bit professional and a little bit relaxing at the same time. So there can be multiple purposes. So we also have friends that have multiple purposes. And then we have some that we own sometimes align and title for certain situations, certain issues, and certain types of environments. And that's okay. Financial wellness. We're using a headband or a hair tie. It includes our relationship with money, our skills to manage resources and live within our means. Part of this dimension includes an awareness that everyone's financial values, needs, and circumstances are unique. And the connection to the headband or the hair tie is that it is to hold your hair down or to allow you to complete your exercise routine. We must have the same constraints financially. Be conservative or tighten your spending, which will allow for you to have financial freedom and wealth. And this will look different from person to person. Headbands are different sizes and once again, different colors, and hair ties are the same. And then some of us don't have any hair. And so again, we can still use this analogy to say, how do we once again provide different types of boundaries and then also resources to make sure that we're financially free and also financially well. Occupational wellness is once again that personal satisfaction and enrichment in one's life through work and seeking opportunities for growth through professional development. And then most importantly is our sense of purpose and happiness and enrichment of our life. And with this connection, we're using the towel. Towels are often thought of as to have only one use, which is to dry. However, it can serve a multitude of purposes. This means not getting stuck in one job or not utilizing our skill or just one skill, and most importantly, being open to change. And so again, the towel can have multiple purposes, from tying our hair to being wrapped around our body to once again to being folded and used as a pillow, depending on what we're doing it for. And so many of us have multiple skill sets. So once again, allowing ourselves not to get stuck in using only certain skills and allowing ourselves to once again to be creative. And then the next two that are last is cultural wellness and intellectual wellness. Cultural wellness is, again, being aware of our own cultural background as well as the diversity and richness that's present in other people's cultural backgrounds. It indicates understanding, awareness, and intrinsic respect for all aspects of diversity. And with the connection with the water bottle, it comes in different shapes and sizes. However, regardless of its form, it's still water. This relates to our need to accept differences, yet understand we essentially are all the same, human. And then with intellectual wellness, it involves maintaining an active mind, exploring new interests, problem solving, and the ability to think critically. And with this one, we're using the connection with the protein bar shake because it rejuvenates, it gives energy, and is a healing component in the body, protein. This relates to our knowledge and gives energy, and its prevention documented in health and wellness. So it's not about being smart, but more so about being a lifelong learner. So we know that, once again, we're constantly learning. So that's the connection with intellectual wellness. And I apologize, there's actually one more. I keep forgetting we added on, it's 9 now. And the last one is environmental wellness, which is an awareness of an individual's relationship and the impact on physical surroundings and habitat. It means developing and maintaining a living environment that is safe, comfortable, and harmony within our natural resources. And the connection with this is our electrolyte drinks, from Propel to Gatorade and everything and Powerade in between. But what we know is that electrolytes are tiny particles that carry electrical charges. When you sweat, electrolytes keep water balanced both inside and outside of the cells so that your muscles and organs can continue to serve you properly. This relates to our need to have balance and harmony, not only within our homes, but within the larger communities as well. So additionally, imbalance internally or externally can cause malfunction within our health and wellness, and of course, within our environments. Dr. Elbert?
So as we transition and talk about self-care and maintenance, this is my favorite thing to wrap up with. The students that I've engaged with and some of my coaching clients is that we need to nurture ourselves emotionally, physically, spiritually, and mentally. And self-care can be so empowering and it allows them to take charge of their life. When we are overwhelmed, we lack the energy and focus to make clear decisions than we normally would, that fogginess that I often hear from students. And when we're unable to problem solve, if we take care of ourselves regularly, we can better handle life's challenges as things come up. The one thing I can promise students is that change will happen and then they will experience things that can cause stress. And so I always challenge my students to arrange time in their schedules for self-care. Same thing for us as professionals. For those who have it in their phone, put it in your calendar. For those who still prefer a little booklet, a calendar, I say put it in Sharpie. That is my rule, has been my rule for quite some time. And then more importantly, get people to hold you accountable for that and have accountability partners. Next slide. So, what comes to mind when you see this glass of water? Is the glass half full, half empty? My favorite, what kind of glass is it? Is it plastic? Is it real glass, the fake glass? Is this Brita water, the good water? How heavy is the glass? And so oftentimes people start to go, into all those questions, but really it's not about the glass, it's not about the water necessarily, but it's about the aspect of not necessarily the weight of the glass, but it does depend on this one specific component, is how long you hold the glass. If you hold it for a minute, it's not a problem. If you hold it for an hour, your arm will start to ache. If you hold it for a day, your arm might go numb and you might feel paralyzed. In each of these cases, when we're engaging in health and well-being work, specifically looking at the whole person, the glass doesn't change, but the longer they hold on to things, this starts that healing conversation we had, the heavier it becomes. The stresses and the worrying that we have are like that glass of water. Think about them for a while and nothing happens. But the longer you hold on to that glass, you become physically and emotionally hurt. When you think about them all day, you can become paralyzed, incapable of times doing anything. So it's important, as I tell those I engage with, to let go of the stressors as early as you can, to put down the burdens, to put down the glass. And that will allow you to start moving forward. It's just taking that first step. Next slide. The
So as
body,
we,
go ahead.
so
Sherrá.
I was going to say, as we end, we want to make sure that you know that we're going to have a few minutes for questions, but I will let Dr. Elbert end with this proverb and also a quick intervention.
The body heals with play, the mind heals with laughter, and the spirit heals with joy. So this is what I want you all to think about as we wrap up. Let's close our eyes and think about all the things you have to do for the remainder of this week. If anybody's looked at their Outlook calendar and it looks like mine, oh, blessed quietness. Think about that. Once you're done with your list, open your eyes and let's go to the chat box. And by reaction within the chat box, my first question and only question is, how many of you all put yourself on that list of things to do for the rest of this week? If you did, awesome. If you didn't, this is what we mean by surviving to thriving. You must put yourself first on the list. Encourage those you engage with to put themselves on the list, preferably at the top. Otherwise, our ability, their ability to be well and maintain wellness will be stifled. We appreciate the time and energy. I know we have some questions over here in the Q&A, and we can transition to those and any that come up through the chat box. All right. So, you want to take the first question, Sherrá?
Yes. So the very first question that we see, why aren't minority needs of wellness not discussed more or addressed more in professional levels? She says, I have never heard of much of this information until now. Do you believe systems or people are scared also to address these needs? And many times minorities, even here in the North, find it difficult to discuss their needs, especially in systems when there are a few minorities in the professional realm. So I tackle each question kind of as we go down. All of these are very good questions. We don't talk about it because we were taught not to. What goes on in the house stays in the house. And the house sometimes is not just encompassing of the physical house, it's also the physical body of the house. I'm not going to talk about what I'm suffering through, or I'm trying to heal through, or what I'm trying to work my way through. Two, I think it's very important to understand that though organizations have begun to transcend within the last 10 to 15 years about creating organizational wellness, there are still many businesses, small to large, who are scared about, can we really afford to implement occupational wellness and well-being in our workplaces, even though there's substantial data to support recidivism, to decrease that, to import satisfactoriness of work, to support, more productivity within work. Again, I think some people are thinking that it's too much of a cost. And then also when it comes to, do I believe that
one piece, some recent data came out in looking at when people type in to Google, and y'all can feel free to do this, type in health and wellness, who and what comes up? Primarily white women. And so the first thing is, for me and for Sherrá, has been creating the pipeline for those who want to follow in our footsteps. So we do a lot of mentoring and coaching, and we do a lot of these type of conversations to make sure that eventually, when the Googling continues to happen, more pictures of people who represent the diaspora and diversity of this field start to show up. So that's the first thing. And so as a field, we have to be much more pushy about being at the table. And I often say, I stopped waiting for the invitation and came up with my own table and chair and propped it right beside everybody else's. And I didn't wait for the invitation, but that's a level of privilege that took time for me to get to now as an AVP. And so now my job is to create space and bring them alongside of me. And that's just overall. So yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've attended conferences and it's about elevating the career, but they don't talk about the sacrifices you make when you do those things, and the ability to not have as much work-life balance as you move up into a more administrative roles.
So there was a quick question in the chat box that says that, I have really bad insomnia and I work 2 jobs. What does self-care look like in that case? To be completely transparent, the very first thing is to identify where the insomnia is coming from. Have you had a full wellness checkup? Have you got a referral to a sleep specialist? Because just because you're working 2 jobs shouldn't necessarily equate to you having insomnia. So again, going back to Dr. Albert's and my favorite word, what's the root cause? What's causing it? Then secondly, learning to create a sleep hygiene. And sleep hygiene is like creating like a treatment plan for sleep. Coming up with different types of resources and tools to implement, and most importantly, a routine that will allow for you to sleep your best. And keeping in mind, your best may look different from someone else's. Your best may be 5 or 6 hours, while other people's best may be 10 hours. I know some people who go to bed every night at 9 o'clock, no matter what. I'm like, but that's when the good stuff come on TV. So everyone's truly different. A good second question that we have in the question box is, when are insurances and insurance companies going to talk about historical trauma? And when is the DSM going to add this? What I can say, we've talked about this in many of our minority clinician spaces, is that there were more of us at the table when they redid the DSM-5 this last time, more people of color. However, we need to continue to be at the table to talk about specific things that affect minorities. There are, and even within our substance use field, there were many things that wasn't created and put into the DSM-5 that should have been, and that's a whole different workshop. However, what we have seen in over the last couple of years is that insurance companies are now starting to pay for, in certain spaces, wellness coaching and well-being coaching. So there has been a shift to show that we have to do everything from prevention to treatment. So working across that paradigm of, once again, preventing people from getting sick and from getting sicker, and creating good health and self-care plans, and treating those who, once again, need the help and need to work on some of those core beliefs and some of those root work. So we are evolving. Dr. Albert, you want to do the last 2?
How do we strive to change the mindset that health wellness within ethnic and minority communities should not just be an idea, but a principle? It starts by going to places where we gather. So, within our own business, Sister Wells Counseling, Coaching, and Consulting, we create spaces. One of our most popular programs is the Cupcakes Conversations, and what's the third C?
Cupcakes, Cocktails, and Conversations.
Yeah, all that. Yeah. And so we have a primary care physician, OBGYN, a sex therapist, a sexual health educator, and many others on the panel to answer questions. And even though they're coming in to talk about relationships and sexual health, we get to talk about mental health at the same time. We talk about self-esteem. We have to start creating the spaces and not waiting for others to create it. We have to start giving permission that people's health and wellness can look very different. Again, my favorite, you can have Jesus and a therapist. And a lot of times it's challenging those cultural or religious norms that have unfortunately boxed us in and created some of the toxic mentalities we have on how we approach health and wellness. And I remember when my sister started talking about some of the therapy she was doing, and my grandma was like, we just didn't do stuff like that. I'm like, well, Granny, times is changing. And when I told her I was a sexual health educator, and I brought in my penis models and my vulva to show her what I was doing in undergrad, she about had a heart attack. But guess what? When she got divorced and she started dating, I went right back with that same kit, because again, we know this population is becoming divorced and becoming much more sexually active. She got to see it. We have to start normalizing these conversations, one person, one community at a time. And the more we do this and normalize it, the much more receptive we will get in certain groups and have more invitations to have these conversations. And then the CBT one is yours, Sherrá. I know we've had this conversation based off a colleague I have who loves cognitive behavior therapy, but I'm gonna let you take this last one.
There's so many different others, and I will mention just a few. And keep in mind, this is not any biases, and once again, I'm not trained in everything. But there are there's some ancestral theories that are being created, and once in that you can intersect with some parts of CBT. But what we know that works good, EMDR, brain spotting, those type of therapies that allows for the cognitive processing. And then some even parts of DBT work will allow good for, once again, for working with different types of racial trauma. Again, that's just off the top of my head. I don't have all the lists, but if you email me, I don't mind providing that. That's in a whole different workshop, but you're welcome to email me. I will share our contact information so you can have that. I forgot to post that. But if you send me that, I would definitely share all of the different types of theories. There's about a good 6 that we recommend for racial trauma.
I'll end with one of my favorite quotes. It's hard to be what you can't see. So for those of you all who are doing this amazing work, keep being present, keep pushing the normative to change what is needed to serve the diverse populations we serve, refill your cups, build communities. We were both on social media, but our stories have meaning and our meaning has life. And as long as we all have the ability to take a deep breath to some capacity, we have more work to do. It has been a pleasure. Thank you for giving us time and space. And what I wish for each of us is peace and light as we take this journey to do this work that can be daunting. And so we're here to engage with you all beyond this space, and we'll turn it back over to Michaela.